seen such outrageous, vicious, distorted reporting in 27 years of public life.
What is it about the television coverage of you in these past weeks and months that has so aroused your anger?
Don't get the impression that you arouse my anger.
Madman theory. I think that overstates it. I remember
such outrageous, vicious, distorted reporting in 27 years of public life.
What is it about the television coverage of you in these past weeks and months that has so aroused your anger?
Don't get the impression that you arouse my anger. One can only be angry with those he respects.
Donald Trump rants and raves at the press. I'm not ranting and raving. I'm just telling you, you're dishonest people. But, I'm not ranting and raving.
The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times.
Trump is certainly the heir to Nixon in more ways than one, and I think he's certainly at least a fellow traveler of the so-called madman theory.
It isn't just what I would call a madman theory. I think that overstates it.
Do you think they were afraid of you?
Oh, yes. Well, they were afraid of me, though, not because of my appearances and not because of my speeches, but because of what I had done. There is nothing that added more to my credibility, certainly with the Russians, and with others as well, than that I took great risks in order to bring the war to Vietnam to a conclusion. All of these actions, you don't take them in order to prove that you're a madman or that you're a tough guy or a macho and the rest. It's simply you take them when it is in the interest of your foreign policy, and also to make sure that you are a credible leader.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Trip the Beltway Fantastic. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am the editor-in-chief of Responsible Statecraft at the Quincy Institute and the host of this wonderful program. My producers, Chris and Sonia, are in the back end as always. And before we go on, I just want to say, if you're watching on YouTube, please hit subscribe and like. We're trying to beat the algorithm, and we need all of the attention and outreach we possibly can get. I am very excited today to talk about the madman theory. Not mad men, but madman theory with author James Boyse today. Thank you, James, for joining us.
Kelly, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm very happy to be here and talk about this wonderful subject. Thank you.
Yes. So before we go on, James is a senior research fellow at University College London at the Center on U.S. Politics. Based in Boston, he focuses on U.S. politics and grand strategy with over a decade's experience in political analysis work for BBC, Sky News, CNBC, and CNN. He has published 3 books to date. This is very interesting. Clinton's Grand Strategy, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Post-Cold War World, Hillary Rising, and Clinton's War on Terror. And his 4th book, as we mentioned, is U.S. Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory, from Nixon to Trump, which we'll be talking about today. So a wonderful montage, introductory film clip that Chris put together this morning for us. And it was a little teaser because I feel like if you're outside of the sort of grand strategy space, which I know that you are fully into, James, but if you're outside of it, you might be thinking, well, I think I've heard of the madman theory, particularly in relation to Donald Trump and his foreign policy ethos. But can you take us back a little through history? I know you've written quite extensively on the history of the theory itself. And can you talk a little bit about what the madman theory is? And I understand it dates back even before Nixon.
Yeah, I can. It's a greatly misunderstood concept, which is why I wanted to write the book. In a nutshell, the madman theory is a tactic employed as part of a wider strategy by a sane leader who feigns irrationality to convince an adversary that there is at least a 1% chance that a disproportionate threat will be delivered upon them if their aims and ambitions are not met. And that, in a nutshell, is what the madman theory is about. It has its intellectual origins, arguably, here in Boston at Harvard University, when the likes of Thomas Schelling and Daniel Ellsberg and Henry Kissinger were devising new approaches to strategy with which to wage the Cold War during the Eisenhower years. If you want to be really, really analytical about this, you could go back to the writings of Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, all of whom talk about the idea of being a little bit crazy and how craziness can be an advantage in negotiations. But it was those three gentlemen at Harvard in the 50s who very much come up with the intellectual basis for the madman theory. And then we can see during Eisenhower's time as president, when he, along with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and Vice President Nixon, utilized this concept of brinkmanship, of massive retaliation, to threaten America's adversaries, sometimes secretly, with the threat of potential nuclear war if their aims are not met. And this is very much where Nixon gets the idea from that he wishes to then implement along with Dr. Kissinger when he is president following the 1968 election.
Okay, so what does Nixon mean when he said, and I believe it was in that clip, when he says, well, it's not a, he seems to embrace the madman theory, first of all. But second of all, he says, well, it's not really what I said that scared people, that scared the Russians in particular. It's what I did. What did he mean about that? And can you talk a little bit more about how he embraced the madman theory?
Well, I was thinking about this before I came on air, and I was reminded of that wonderful movie, The Fight Club. And of course, the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. And it's a little bit like that with the madman theory, frankly. It's difficult to find Nixon or Kissinger discussing this openly. So it's wonderful that that Chris was able to find that clip and put that for viewers to address, because all too often, I think, people question whether Nixon actually addressed this, embraced it, et cetera, and what Nixon is talking about, I think, is this idea that anybody who utilizes the madman theory has to utilize what I call the credible threat. You cannot be 100% logical and rational and then all of a sudden wake up one morning and expect to be taken seriously if you feign irrationality. You have to have a basis for this. Dwight Eisenhower, when he attempted to utilize this on the Korean Peninsula, had his own credible threat based upon his background as Supreme Allied Commander of European forces in the Second World War. The nation had a credible threat predicated upon its recent use of the nuclear arsenal in Japan. And what Nixon claimed to be his credible threat was his entire career as a virulent anti-communist, someone who had supported and worked alongside John Foster Dulles and Dwight D. Eisenhower during that time in office. And then when he becomes president, along with Dr. Kissinger, the two of them engage in a series of escapades, which I describe in the book, in which they attempt to secretly threaten North Vietnam with virtual annihilation if their ambitions of withdrawing from Vietnam are not met on a very truncated time period.
So, okay, can you talk to me a little bit about the difference between credible deterrence, which I totally understand. It's like you are signaling to the adversary that you could kick their ass if prompted because you are positioned well with weapons, with the capability to do so, and being a madman. Like, where is that line, from deterrence to unpredictability and potential craziness?
Yeah, well, I think actually you touch upon it right there at the end of your question. I think the former has to do with presenting oneself as a rational actor, someone who's going to act within expected norms of international behavior, even if that involves potential armed conflict. We've seen American presidents, world leaders throughout history engaging in the former concept that you just described. the United States has clearly been the overwhelming military force throughout the last several decades, and it has used that force around the world on a pretty regular basis. But what you've seen on those occasions is a sane American president presenting themselves as a rational actor, seeking to engage with another rational actor, albeit potentially through military aims. The latter concept of moving towards the madman theory basically abandons any pretext of rationality and instead presents, in this case, an American president in an act, a feigning of irrationality in an attempt to destabilize one's opponents. And the aim here, of course, is not actually to get into a fight, is not to get into a hot war, but to convince an adversary that because you're so irrational, you could sow a seed of 1% doubt that you might not just engage in, relatively straightforward conflict, but you might go the whole hog and deploy America's nuclear arsenal. And that, I think, is the way to distinguish between the two approaches to policy that you rightly raise.
How did Nixon deploy madman theory in Vietnam? Could you go into a little bit of detail? And was he signaling not only to Hanoi, but was he signaling to Russia and China as well? And this is all in 1972? Just to put
it's in the lead up to that.
context.
So actually, as soon as Nixon takes office, he and Dr. Kissinger are beginning to talk about this. He had mentioned it to his campaign aide, H.R. Haldeman, at the height of the 1968 campaign season. When he becomes president, he and Dr. Kissinger begin discussing ways that the madman theory can be implemented. And that takes a series of steps. I talk about them and how they're utilized in Laos and in Cambodia and in Vietnam itself. Simply the move into Cambodia is arguably an example of the madman theory. Cambodia, of course, was a neutral country. It was beyond the scope of the congressionally mandated activities that the president was authorized to operate within in his actions as president in Vietnam. So simply moving into Cambodia was beyond the pale and was seen to be an excessive act. The way in which the president was doing that in terms of hiding those bombing missions, I think could be seen as an example of that. And then again, one of the great ironies in this is that one of the reasons we know so much about Nixon and Kissinger's attempt to implement this is because of the taping system that he reinstalled, in part to convince historians such as ourselves that he was driving American foreign policy and not Dr. Kissinger. So you have the two of them discussing how it is that they want to dispatch Kissinger around the world to meet up with the leadership in Hanoi and Moscow and confide in them the terrible news that he is now working for a madman who is threatening mad activity against them if Nixon's demands are not met. We must assuage the mad leader, otherwise we're all in trouble. And again, we can actually go back and read the transcripts of Kissinger and Nixon discussing this, which I'm very happily reproduced in the book.
So did the madman theory work for Nixon in this case, in the case of ending the Vietnam War, in your mind?
Well, I think this is where it gets kind of interesting. We can see how Nixon understands the concept, wants to deploy it. He can rely upon Dr. Kissinger's intellectual capacity to do this based upon his work at Harvard. But where it becomes difficult with Nixon, I think, is to quite see where it was successful. You saw in the opening clip Nixon talking about utilizing a credible threat, and that's certainly the case. But when you look at the timescales within which the Vietnam War ended, it got drawn out a lot longer than Nixon and Kissinger had anticipated when they took office. In fact, it's not ultimately, a peace deal isn't agreed until some 3 days after Nixon takes his second oath of office in January 1973. And again, if you look at the case-by-case studies, what Nixon attempts to do across North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, we can see the activities. What you can't see necessarily is the obvious reaction from the leadership in Hanoi to basically come to the negotiating table on the timescales that Nixon had indeed hoped for. Ultimately, I think the leadership in Hanoi and Moscow simply refused to believe that Richard Nixon was capable of committing the kind of atrocities of which he was discussing.
And I don't mean to go back a step, but before I forget, I know Daniel Ellsberg is near and dear to many hearts of folks who watch my show, who follow Responsible Statecraft and the Quincy Institute. He pops up at the beginning of the book as one of the three people who had sort of contributed to I would say the definition of the Madman theory. Can you talk a little bit about his role while he was at Rand in doing that?
Yeah, very much. I mean, Ellsberg is a fascinating character, and he is central to the story. One of the things I was determined to do with this book is I had seen people in the past utilize the Madman theory simply as a way to attack, firstly, President Nixon, and then subsequently President Trump. And what I had not seen anybody do was to try to make tell the wider story of how the concept was devised at Harvard and Rand, and then implemented by 3 Republican administrations. And Ellsberg is key to this. He is an academic at Harvard. He is very much in awe, I think, of the work of Thomas Schelling, who was a mentor to him. And the two men very much play a sort of like, well, me first, no, you go afterwards approach. Ellsberg gives a public lecture at Boston Public Library in which he talks about the political use of madness and how it is that politicians can feign madness in an attempt to convince an adversary of their irrational intent, which of course is the cornerstone of the Madman theory. That is then picked up by his colleague at Harvard, Henry Kissinger, who invites him to basically deliver the same address to Kissinger's own students. So you now have the relationship between Ellsberg, Kissinger, and Schelling having been established. Some 10 years later on, when Kissinger has been appointed National Security Advisor, you have a remarkable meeting of minds at the Hotel Pierre on the island of Manhattan during the Nixon transition, when Kissinger invites Schelling and Ellsberg and others from Harvard and Rand to discuss what it is that the incoming administration's policy should be on Vietnam, and to devise the very first documents for the National Security Council meetings, which will devise exactly what it is that Kissinger's approach to Vietnam will be. So we have this remarkable scenario whereby Ellsberg, who will become the bête noire of the Nixon administration, the hero to liberals for leaking the Pentagon Papers, is arguably an architect not only of the Madman theory, but of the Vietnam War and of Nixon's approach to it. And indeed, ultimately, I think, you can see how Ellsberg's involvement with the Madman theory will lead to Nixon's downfall, because of course it's after he leaks the Pentagon Papers that the White House Plumbers Department start to burglarize Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for evidence of his craziness, of his instability, and of course that begins the slippery slope of the crimes of Watergate.
Oh my goodness, unbelievable.
It really is.
I love it. That's incredible. Well, before we get to Trump, because that's the meat and potatoes of this discussion, I believe, but I mean, not that your research isn't, but I'm just saying in terms of the political salience of the current moment, have there been any other American leaders who have tried to deploy? I realize we're going from Nixon to Trump. Anybody in between there?
Well, how about I go back even further? Because one of the things that's wonderful about doing a research project over the several years that I've been doing this is that, my wife and I moved to the United States in 2019, and we're basically doing the 50-state challenge. And we're doing pretty well. We're about 38 at the moment. We're heading off to the West Coast in a couple of days' time to do some more. But one of my great discoveries was finding out more about James Polk when we visited his part of the world down in Tennessee. And it's interesting, I think, to understand how James Polk, the 11th American president, a one-term president, managed, I think, to utilize the Madman theory against Great Britain in his efforts to obtain the Oregon Territory, and against the Mexicans in the American-Mexican War, in which that conflict obviously managed to bring in part Texas and much of the Southwest and California into the United States, and in so doing add far more territory to the United States than, say, for example, Thomas Jefferson did in the Louisiana Purchase, which everybody knows about, and far too few people, I think, understand what James Polk did and how he utilized his reputation for irrationality, instability, and an unwillingness to back down against both Great Britain and Mexico during, what was that, the 1840s, I guess.
So I guess depending where you are, politically, ideologically, you might say, wow, that's a lot of winning with the Madman theory on Polk's behalf. I know a lot of folks aren't really, there are folks who aren't very fond of expansionism, but that does seem like more of a working example of Madman theory. Would you say that? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, our understanding of, from a global point of view, about the size, the scope, and the very definition of what this wonderful country is about, has in large part to do with manifest destiny and the movement of the American, population from sea to shining sea and totally dominating the North American continent, and that I think you can attribute in some part, maybe large part, to the utilization of what becomes the Madman theory by James Polk.
Wow.
There you go.
Well, let's move on to Trump. I know when I met you last week at a book talk at the National Interest, that was, a focus, not the focus, but a focus of the discussion. And it kind of splits into two parts. In your book, you talk about how Trump is actually, before he even came on to his second administration, was already boasting to donors that he had been deploying, his version of the Madman theory with Putin on the Ukraine war. And he said, I was with Putin and I told him, Vladimir, if you do it, meaning invade Ukraine, we're going to bomb the shit out of Moscow, Trump revealed, according to an audio recording. He thought I was crazy. He didn't believe me either, except 10%. And 10% is all you need. So Trump obviously has felt that this was an important, critical tactic early on. And it may have worked in 2020, and Putin decided, well, if I'm going to really pull the trigger on this, it's going to be under Biden, who hasn't conveyed a similar ethos. Let's just start with Ukraine. Has this worked with Russia and Ukraine? Maybe there's a different story post 2024.
Yeah, and I think it's important to take this in two stages, but also to caveat this with, at the moment, we're having to rely upon the testimony and the word of Donald Trump, relying what it is that Vladimir Putin has said. So there is a degree to which we have to take this with a pinch of salt, and many people will come to this with their own political perspective. And again, this book is not an attempt to lionize nor demonize Trump or Nixon, but merely to discuss the concept of the Madman theory and how it is that perhaps the two leaders have utilized it. That being said, Donald Trump has repeatedly said that, in his view, Vladimir Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if he had won a second consecutive term in office in, what would that be, the 2020 election. Now, we cannot prove that, but what we can say is that Vladimir Putin did not invade Ukraine during Donald Trump's first term in office. He had in the past, under both Republican and Democratic leaders, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, invaded the territories of Georgia and Crimea. Nothing under Donald Trump's first term in office. So Trump would say, look, because Vladimir Putin feared me, he did nothing. He didn't antagonize us when I was in office. He waited until a weaker president, as Trump would define Biden, and only then did he do so. He recognizes in the statement that you repeat from my book, the idea that Putin believed that there was a possibility, not 100%, but a possibility that he would do it. And part of the madman theory you don't need to convince someone that there's a 100% possibility, just as long as there is little as a 1% possibility. So I was fascinated to see Donald Trump utilize that very expression, that he didn't need to be convinced 100%. The White House has also referred to, and I'm quoting Caroline Leavitt here, that the Trump administration has engaged in purposeful strategic ambiguity. Now, if you think about what that means, purposeful strategic ambiguity, it's deliberate, it's ambiguous, and it's strategic. And at the heart of that is their own definition of what the madman theory is, I believe. So when you couple that with Donald Trump's recognition that he only needed to convince Vladimir Putin that there was in his case, 10% chance that something might happen, I think you can see how it is that this White House, without having the intellectual input of a Henry Kissinger, realizes the Nixon model of peace through strength coupled with a perceived irrationality can have long-term benefits for the United States. However, to come back to your exact question, how has that been borne out with Ukraine? I'm not entirely sure that it has vis-a-vis Russia, but certainly what you're seeing with Donald Trump's approach to Zelensky, I think you're seeing some impact there. The much vaunted public display in the Oval Office in the first months of the second term was something the world had never actually perceived before. But I think with that, what you saw was an annoyance with Zelensky for refusing to sign a deal to release rare earth minerals to the United States that he had continued to prevaricate on. And as a result, you saw Donald Trump resorting to this sort of seemingly irrational, erratic behavior. But it ultimately borne out. I mean, the deal was agreed upon, and I think that forms part of a wider strategy this administration is focused on with regard to access to energy, which forms part of a wider strategy, which we can perhaps talk about later.
Yeah, but that seems so 2025 at this point because he got the deal. But the big deal, which would be ending the war, he is ultimately out of his grasp, though he has threatened Zelensky. He bullied him in the Oval Office, which you mentioned in the book as well, during that infamous meeting at the beginning of his term. He's warned and threatened Putin to get his butt over to the negotiating table to no avail. You do mention NATO and how he's threatened NATO to carry on more responsibility for its defense and contributing more to the coffers for the alliance, which they all did agree upon. But do you think that the madman theory went off the rails since then in terms of the Iran war? And you do talk about this in your book, which we have to bring it up to date because here is a president who no longer seems strategic and deliberate, but flailing in his threats. And it's gotten to the point where the joke is that nobody believes them anymore because he threatens to attack. He threatens nuclear annihilation, basically, where he says, I'm going to end your civilization if you don't do what I want. There will be a big, giant glow where Iran used to be. And there seems to be a collective shrug, even from NATO, who he had just threatened to the point where they scrambled to get their contributions. They're saying, we're not going to help you open up the strait. They don't seem concerned.
Okay, let me see. There's a lot to unpack in there, Callie, let's be honest about it. I think what you will see is the madman theory cannot and should not be applied universally to every country in every circumstance. Because if that were to be the case, then that, I think, would undermine the very concept of what the madman theory is about. Because then it would just be a general approach to strategy, come what may. And very clearly there are examples whereby it's feasible to utilize this approach against a weaker country. And what you don't see, for example, is in the case of Eisenhower or Nixon, either president making an outright threat to go nuclear against the Soviet Union, for example. It's always against a smaller adversary who cannot strike back in the same devastating way. So I think we need to recognize that for a start. Clearly, I think Donald Trump has been more successful than Richard Nixon in his embrace of this approach, because there are and have been plenty of people around the world, both in academia, in journalism, and in positions of power, who are willing to believe that Donald Trump is erratic enough, irrational enough to deploy excessive force, be that militarily or economic, in the advance of his policies. And I think we saw that with the issues to do with how it is that the tariff policy was enacted, for example, and as you rightly point out, NATO. Now, where life does get interesting is with regards to Iran, because Donald Trump has long talked about Iran being an existential threat to the United States, and in so doing, he's followed a long line of American presidents, going all the way back, arguably, to Jimmy Carter, who have spoken vociferously about the threat from Iran, but have not actually followed through in an attempt to implement the kind of change that we see Donald Trump looking to do. The problem ultimately, though, I think, is that it's uncertain at this point quite what Donald Trump wants to achieve in that part of the world. He is understandably reticent to use the word regime change, because I think all of the baggage that brings with it, going back to the George W. Bush administration and subsequent exercises. It's also problematic to expect, I think, the Iranian people to simply rise up from the streets, having been suppressed for so long against such a deadly regime, in the hope that the United States will support them. Because, of course, I hate to say this, the Hungarian people thought the same, the Czechoslovakians thought the same, and in both cases, I regret to say, American support was not there, and those populations were crushed in a bloody downput by their leadership. So history does not augur well in that sense. And of course, you rightly raised the question of NATO and its lack of support. In my own country, the United Kingdom, we have a political party in power who are politically opposed to Donald Trump, coming from the relative hard left. You have a leader there who was a staunch, a very renowned lawyer. His attorney general is supporting his view that what Donald Trump is talking about would amount to a war crime. And of course, neither the attorney general nor the prime minister of the day want to end up at The Hague charged with a war crime. So you're seeing an interesting and troubling distancing with the United States and its NATO allies at just the moment, arguably, when if those forces could come together and find a way forward, perhaps this regime could be finally toppled, and the Iranian people, who, of course, we lose sight of far too easily, could finally be freed, and you have a new regime in the Middle East, which I think would, if that were to happen, position Donald Trump as the most influential American president, certainly since Ronald Reagan.
You know, I think a lot of folks would probably say or respond to you and say that maybe diplomacy might have been the better course rather than deploying the Madman theory, and it might have gotten what they wanted in a more reasonable Iran with restrictions on its existential threat vis-a-vis its nuclear program if it just stayed in talks rather than bombing it. But that's another debate for a future show that I hope you'll come on. But before you leave,
I'd be delighted to, because it's a great question.
Yeah, no,
and it's also a great answer, actually.
Yeah, no, I'd love to have you back on to talk more about like the policies itself and themselves in the Middle East. But I just, before we leave, can we talk about Cuba? Because I think this is the best example of where the administration is currently deploying the Madman theory. They're doing everything to threaten Cuba, whether it be the blockading, the threat to indict Raul Castro, to military invasion. And Cuba is probably looking around just like we are at what's happening in Iran, but also what happened in Venezuela at the beginning of the year. So far, they haven't capitulated. Can you talk a little bit about how this is being deployed down there and what might happen?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think that what you are seeing is some interesting joined up thinking by this administration, which far too few people are actually latching onto. If you look at what's happened with Venezuela, for example, you see the moves with regard to Cuba. Fascinating to see, obviously, Marco Rubio taking the lead with regard to this, considering both his Cuban heritage, his current position as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, a role which, of course, don't forget, has not been filled by one man since Henry Kissinger, and also, obviously, his eye to the future. You know, does he seek the presidency in 2028? Does he stamp aside and let J.D. Vance run? But very clearly, Cuba is close to the heart of the Secretary of State and to Donald Trump. The idea that you could finally see a free Cuba emerging under President Trump, I think is again akin to what he would very much like to achieve in the Middle East. This is very clearly a president who wishes to see himself as a great president who achieves great things. We have sometimes had placeholders in the White House. Donald Trump does not want to be a placeholder. He sees the great man of history concept. He sees how it is that Richard Nixon bestrode the world, how Ronald Reagan bestrode the world. And he clearly wants to bring about sweeping change on a truncated time period. You know, we've got the midterm elections coming up in 6 months' time. And then after that, you move into, you know, everybody's thinking about who's going to replace Donald Trump. So he's got to do things quickly and swiftly before he becomes a lame duck. And it'd be fascinating to see whether Cuba ends up finally falling back into the ultimate domain of the United States.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll definitely have to bring you back on because we're going to have plenty to talk about in the next several months because something's going to break there on the Cuba front and ahead of the midterms as well. So thank you, James, for joining me. I'm so excited. I encourage folks to read this, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum. It's great history, and just very happy to have you on. And thanks to our listeners on audio only, because we are also on Spotify, we're on Apple, we're on Amazon, we're on iHeartRadio. So please give us a good rating so we can get more reach out to those listeners, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.